Your interpreter is lying." The words slipped out of Tebogo's mouth before she could stop them. The room froze. Crystal glasses hovered mid-air. Pens stopped moving. Every powerful man at that polished table turned to stare at the young waitress as if she had just signed her own dismissal. Sibusiso's face darkened with fury. This was a multi-million-dollar deal, and she, a nobody, had just interrupted it. But Tebogo didn't back down, because she understood every word the interpreter had twisted, and she knew that if she stayed silent, the truth would die right there in that room. And, somehow, she couldn't let that happen. "Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there? And if stories like this move, you don't forget to subscribe. You never know which story might change how you see the world." The first thing people noticed about the Royal Crescent Hotel in Johannesburg was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that came from power. Conversations softened into murmurs. Shoes glided instead of stepped. Even laughter, when it appeared, was carefully measured, as though joy itself needed permission to exist within those polished walls. Tebogo had learned to move inside that silence without disturbing it. She woke before sunrise each day in a narrow room she rented in Hillbrow, where the walls were thin enough to hear arguments from strangers and the city never truly slept. By 5:30 a.m. she was already dressed in her uniform. A crisp white shirt, black skirt, and low heels, worn just enough to remind her how long she had been standing in other people's spaces without ever belonging to them. By 7 a.m. she was inside the Royal Crescent. Invisible. That was the word her supervisor once used, though not unkindly. "A good waitress is invisible, Mrs." Kumalo had said, adjusting Tebogo's collar with a firm, practiced hand. "You appear when needed and disappear when you are not. The guests should never have to notice you." Tebogo had nodded, because invisibility in a world like hers was often safer than being seen. She carried trays heavier than they looked, memorized preferences she was never thanked for, and smiled through conversations that sliced through her like glass. "Make sure the VIP lounge is perfect," Mrs. Kumalo said that morning, her voice sharp but controlled. "We have international guests today. Big money, no mistakes." Tebogo simply replied, "Yes, ma'am." But something about that day felt different. The air itself seemed tighter, as though the building was holding its breath. By mid-morning, black luxury SUVs began arriving one after another, their tinted windows reflecting the African sun like shields. Security tightened. Staff whispered in corners. Even the managers moved with unusual urgency. In the VIP lounge, everything gleamed. Glass tables polished to mirror-like perfection. Leather chairs arranged with mathematical precision. Fresh flowers imported that very morning stood in crystal vases. White lilies, delicate and expensive, filling the air with a soft, controlled fragrance. Tebogo moved between the tables, adjusting cutlery, aligning napkins, ensuring that every detail spoke the language of wealth. She didn't need to be told that this meeting mattered. She could feel it. Around 11:15 a.m., the first of the main guests arrived, Sibusiso Dlamini. He didn't need an introduction. Everyone in Johannesburg's business circles knew his name. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a presence that filled the room before he even spoke, Sibusiso carried himself like a man who had never once been ignored. Unlike Tebogo. He walked past her without a glance. She didn't take it personally. Moments later, the second guest entered, Sheikh Karim Al-Farouk. There was a different kind of power around him, quieter, older, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. His robe was simple, but undeniably luxurious. His posture relaxed yet commanding. His eyes, however, were sharp, observant, the kind of eyes that missed very little. Behind him walked a man in a fitted suit carrying a leather briefcase, Yusuf Okoye, the interpreter. Tebogo noticed him because he noticed everything. His gaze flicked across the room, quickly, calculating, measuring. He wasn't the richest man in the room, but he moved like someone who intended to become one. The meeting began shortly after. Tebogo stood near the side, just outside the circle of power, holding a silver tray with glasses of water and imported juice. Close enough to serve, far enough to be forgotten, exactly where she was supposed to be. Sibusiso spoke first, his tone, confident, practiced. Yusuf translated into Arabic smoothly, his voice calm and professional. Sheikh Karim listened occasionally, nodding his fingers, tapping lightly against the arm of his chair. At first, everything seemed normal, predictable, safe. Tebogo moved forward when signaled, placing glasses gently in front of each man. No clinking, no mistakes, no presence beyond the task. But then something shifted. It was subtle, almost nothing. A word. Yusuf translated a sentence, but the rhythm of the Arabic felt wrong. Tebogo froze for half a second. Just half a second. No one noticed, but inside her, something stirred. She had heard that word before. Not in this room, not in this world, but years ago, in a much smaller place with peeling paint and a father whose voice carried warmth even when life didn't. She moved back to her position, heart beating slightly faster now. Focus, she told herself. You're here to serve, nothing more. But the conversation continued, and then it happened again. Another sentence, another shift, another distortion. This time she was sure. Yusuf wasn't translating accurately. He wasn't just adjusting tone or simplifying language. He was changing meaning. Small changes, but powerful ones. Terms that should have been equal were suddenly tilted. Agreements that sounded fair became subtly one-sided. And Sheikh Karim, he was responding based on those altered words. Tebogo's fingers tightened slightly around the tray. No, 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 no. She leaned her head ever so slightly, listening more carefully now. Sibusiso spoke. Yusuf translated. And again wrong. Not completely wrong. Just enough. Enough to shift advantage. Enough to steal without being obvious. Tebogo's breath caught in her chest, because now she understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Her mind raced. Should she say something? No. Of course not. Who was she, a waitress? A replaceable body in a uniform. If she spoke, she wouldn't be heard. And even if she was heard, she would be punished. She could already imagine Mrs. Kumalo's face. The cold disappointment. The quiet dismissal. No shouting, no drama. Just a simple sentence. You've crossed a line. And just like that, no job, no income, no rent, no survival. Tebogo swallowed hard. Stay silent. That's how you survive. But then, Sheikh Karim spoke again, this time longer, more detailed. His Arabic flowed smoothly, confidently, and when Yusuf translated it back into English, everything changed. Tebogo's heart dropped, because what Yusuf said was not what Sheikh Karim had said, not even close. This wasn't a small adjustment anymore. This was a lie, a dangerous one, the kind that could cost millions, the kind that could destroy trust before it was even built. Her chest tightened. She looked at Sheikh Karim, then at Sibusiso, then back at Yusuf. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they trusted too easily, or maybe they simply couldn't understand. But Tebogo could, and now she couldn't unhear it. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, soft, firm, unyielding. Truth is not always safe, Tebogo, but silence can be more dangerous. She hadn't thought about him in a long time. Not like this. Not in the middle of a room where her life could collapse in seconds. Her grip on the tray loosened slightly. Her thoughts collided. If you speak, you lose everything. If you don't, someone else will. Her breathing grew shallow. The room felt smaller, the silence heavier. Yusuf continued speaking, confident, composed, building his version of reality word by word. And Tebogo stood there, at the edge of a decision that would change everything. The room remained calm. Too calm. On the surface, everything still looked exactly as it should, men in tailored suits discussing numbers that could reshape industry's contracts, waiting to be signed, and a quiet waitress standing by the wall with a tray in her hands. But inside Tebogo, nothing was calm anymore. Every word Yusuf spoke now felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through her thoughts, distorting everything she thought she could ignore. She tried to focus on her breathing. In, out. Just serve, just stand, just disappear. But the language wouldn't let her. Arabic. It wasn't supposed to belong to her world. Not to a girl who grew up in a cramped two-room house on the outskirts of Soweto. Not to someone who spent most of her life counting coins before buying bread. And yet, it did. Because long before she became invisible in places like this, there had been a different version of her life. One filled with sound, warmth, and a voice that never made her feel small. Her father. Tebogo shifted her weight slightly, her eyes still fixed forward, but her mind drifting backward, pulled by memories she had tried for years to bury under survival. He had not been a wealthy man, not even close. But to Tebogo, he had once seemed like the smartest person in the world. His name was Cabello, a construction worker who had spent years working in the Middle East, sending money home, building dreams from afar. He came back with calloused hands, tired eyes, and a language no one else in their neighborhood understood. Arabic. At first it had sounded strange to Tebogo, foreign, complicated, but her father had laughed when she struggled with the words. Language is not just words, he used to say, sitting beside her on the floor scribbling letters onto scraps of old paper. It is a key, and one day you may need it to open a door no one else can see. She hadn't understood back then. She just liked the way his voice softened when he taught her, the way he made learning feel like something special, like a secret only the two of them shared. Night after night under a flickering bulb, he taught her. Simple phrases at first. Greetings, numbers, then sentences, then meaning. He didn't just teach her how to translate. He taught her how to listen. Words can lie. He told her once, his expression unusually serious. But meaning reveals truth. Always listen for what is really being said. Tebogo blinked, pulling herself back into the present. Her fingers trembled slightly. Because now, standing in that room, she understood exactly what he meant. Yusuf's words were smooth, flawless, convincing, but the meaning beneath them twisted. Sheikh Karim leaned back slightly in his chair, listening carefully, his fingers steepled together. He was not a careless man, that much was clear, but even the most careful listener could be misled if the bridge between languages was corrupted. And right now, that bridge was Yusuf. Tebogo's eyes flicked toward him again. He showed no sign of hesitation, no guilt, no fear, just confidence. That made it worse, because it meant he had done this before. Her chest tightened. She remembered another night, another moment, the hospital, the smell of antiseptic and fear. Her father lying on a narrow bed, his breathing shallow, his body worn down by years of labor that had given everything and taken even more. They had needed help, money, understanding. But there had been documents, conversations, words spoken by people who assumed she wouldn't understand. She was younger then, too young, too unsure. She had heard things she didn't fully grasp, but enough to know something wasn't right. And she had stayed silent, because she was afraid, because she was just a girl, because no one had asked her to speak. By the time she realized what those words meant, it was too late. Tebogo swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. Her father's voice echoed again. not as a memory now, but as a presence. You must choose who you are even when it costs you. Her grip on the tray tightened again. In front of her, the meeting continued. Numbers were discussed, percentages, ownership, power. Yusuf translated each sentence with precision, or at least, the illusion of precision. Tebogo listened closely, and now she caught everything, every shift, every omission, every manipulation hidden behind polished language. It was almost impressive. Almost, if it hadn't been so dangerous. Sheikh Karim spoke again, his tone calm but firm. This time his words were longer, more detailed, specific clauses, expectations, conditions. Tebogo understood every part of it. Clear, direct, fair. But when Yusuf translated, her heart dropped again, because what came out in English was not just inaccurate. It was completely altered. Key terms were reversed, risks were hidden, advantages were reassigned. It was no longer a negotiation. It was a trap. Tebogo's pulse began to race. She shifted slightly, stepping back as if distance could help her think. But there was nowhere to go. The room felt smaller now, the silence heavier. She glanced toward Mrs. Kumalo near the doorway. Watching, always watching. There would be no forgiveness for interruption. No second chances. Not for someone like her. Tebogo closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Just a second. Inside her mind, two worlds collided. The one she lived in now, where silence meant survival, where obedience meant stability, where invisibility meant safety. And the one her father had tried to prepare her for. Where truth mattered, where courage had weight, where words could change everything. She opened her eyes again. Yusuf was still speaking, confident, unchallenged, untouched. Tebogo's breathing grew uneven, her thoughts sharpened. If she said nothing, this deal would go through, and everything built on it would be wrong, unfair, corrupt, and no one would ever know, because no one else understood, except her. Just her. That realization hit harder than anything else, not the fear, not the risk, but the responsibility. Her father's voice came back one last time. Quiet, steady, unavoidable. A key is useless, if you are too afraid to use it. Tebogo's fingers slowly released the edge of the tray. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure someone would hear it. She took one small step forward, then stopped. No, this was madness. She could lose everything, her job, her home, her future, all for people who didn't even see her, who wouldn't defend her, who might not even believe her. She hesitated, just for a moment, and in that moment, Yusuf finished another sentence, sealing another lie into the air like it belonged there. Something inside Tebogo snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Her fear didn't disappear. It simply moved aside, making space for something stronger. She took another step forward. This time she didn't stop. The tray in her hands trembled slightly as she moved closer to the table, closer to power, to risk, to consequence. Closer to a line she was never meant to cross. No one noticed her yet. Why would they? She was invisible, until she chose not to be. Tebogo inhaled slowly. Her voice felt trapped in her chest, but she forced it upward, through fear, through doubt, through everything that had kept her silent her entire life. And then, she spoke. "Excuse me." The word came out softer than Tebogo intended. For a split second, no one reacted. The meeting continued as if her voice had dissolved into the air, just another sound too small to matter in a room built for power. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Of course. Why would they hear her? She was no one, invisible, replaceable, forgettable. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she almost stepped back. almost disappeared again into the safety of silence. But then Yusuf began speaking again. Another sentence, another lie, and this time something inside Tebogo refused to retreat. "Sir, please." Her voice came out stronger now, not loud, but enough to cut through the careful rhythm of negotiation. The room froze. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like a ripple spreading outward. Sibusiso's pen paused mid-signature. One of the assistants slowly lowered his tablet. The quiet hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt louder. And then, all eyes turned to her. Tebogo felt the weight of it immediately. Not curiosity, not concern, judgment, confusion, irritation. Who is she? Why is she speaking? Doesn't she know her place? Sibusiso's face darkened first. "What is this?" He snapped, his voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "Why is a waitress interrupting this meeting?" Mrs. Kumalo moved quickly from the doorway, her heels clicking against the polished floor like a warning. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, already reaching for Tebogo's arm. "She will leave immediately." Tebogo felt the grip tighten around her wrist. Familiar. Final. This was how it ended. Quietly, efficiently, without a scene. Just like every other girl who had crossed a line she wasn't allowed to see. Her instincts screamed at her to let it happen, to apologize, to lower her head, to disappear. But then she looked at Sheikh Karim, and, for the first time since she entered that room, she saw something different. He wasn't angry, he wasn't dismissive, he was watching her, carefully, as if trying to understand something no one else had even considered. That was all it took. A fraction of a second, a single opening. Tebogo pulled her wrist free, not aggressively, but firmly enough to stop Mrs. Kumalo. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "But your interpreter is not translating correctly." Silence. Heavy, immediate, unforgiving. Mrs. Kumalo's hand froze in midair. Sibusiso blinked once, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I beg your pardon," he said, slowly leaning back in his chair. "Do you even understand what you're saying?" Tebogo swallowed hard. This was it. There was no stepping back now. "Yes, sir," she replied. "I do." Sibusiso's expression shifted from disbelief to irritation. "This is highly inappropriate," he said coldly. "Security. Wait." The word came from Sheikh Karim. Not loud, not forceful, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that didn't need volume to command attention. Everything stopped, even Sibusiso. Sheikh Karim leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Tebogo. "You said the translation is incorrect," he said calmly. "Explain." Tebogo's pulse pounded in her ears. "Explain. How do you speak truth in a room that was never built to hear you?" She took a breath, then another. "You said," she began, slowly looking directly at Sheikh Karim, "now that the partnership would be equal, and that both sides would share control over the project's expansion." She switched to Arabic. Her pronunciation was not perfect, but it was clear, steady, unmistakably understood. She repeated his exact words. The room shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. Yusuf's expression flickered, just for a second. Then Tebogo switched back to English, but he translated it as she said, glancing briefly at Yusuf, "You offering full operational control to Mr. Dlamini's company, while your side would only retain a financial stake." A pause. Sharp. Dangerous. Because now, the difference was clear, and it was not small. Sibusiso straightened in his chair. "That is not," he began. But Sheikh Karim raised his hand slightly, silencing him. His eyes moved to Yusuf. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone still calm but colder now. Yusuf didn't hesitate. "No, sir," he said smoothly. "She is mistaken." Perhaps she picked up a few words and misunderstood the context. Arabic can be complex. Tebogo felt her chest tighten. Of course. He would deny it. Why wouldn't he? He had everything to lose. She had nothing, except the truth. She's a waitress, Sibusiso added sharply. With respect, Sheikh Karim, we cannot allow she will speak. This time, Sheikh Karim's voice carried steel, not loud, but final. The room fell silent again. Tebogo felt her hands tremble. But she didn't stop. You also said, she continued, her voice gaining strength, that any risk related to infrastructure delays would be shared equally between both parties. She repeated the Arabic again, word for word. Then she translated Yusuf's version. He told you, she said, her eyes now locked on Sheikh Karim's, that your company would absorb all risk, while the local partner would receive guaranteed returns. A sharper reaction this time, a shift in posture, a tightening of jaws, because now even those who didn't understand Arabic could hear the imbalance, could feel it. Yusuf's calm began to crack. That is not accurate, he said quickly. You are misrepresenting. Then say it again. The interruption came from Sheikh Karim. He leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering. In Arabic, he said, "Repeat exactly what I said." Yusuf hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The room noticed. Tebogo noticed. Sheikh Karim definitely noticed. Yusuf cleared his throat. Then he spoke. But this time, his words were different, closer, safer, correct, too correct, because now he knew he was being watched. A slow silence spread across the room, the kind that didn't need explanation, the kind that revealed truth without anyone saying it out loud. Sibusiso's expression tightened. Mrs. Kumalo stepped back slightly, unsure now. And Tebogo. She stood there, her heart still racing, but something inside her had shifted. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. Sheikh Karim exhaled slowly. Then he looked at Tebogo again. "You understand Arabic well," he said. It wasn't a question. "No, sir," she replied honestly. "Not perfectly, but enough." "Yes." Another pause. "Then how did you learn?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment she hesitated, but something in his tone made it feel safe. "My father," she said quietly. "He worked abroad. He taught me." Sheikh Karim studied her face for a moment longer. Then he nodded slowly, as if placing a piece into a puzzle. Finally, he turned back to Yusuf. "I believe," he said calmly, "we need a different interpreter." The words landed like a verdict. Final, irreversible. Yusuf's face drained of color. "Sir, you may leave. No anger, no shouting, just authority." And that was enough. Yusuf stood there for a second longer. Then, without another word, he picked up his briefcase and walked out. The door closed softly behind him, but the impact of that moment echoed loudly in the room. No one spoke, no one moved, because something had just changed, not just in the deal, but in the balance of power, and at the center of it all was a girl who was never supposed to be seen. Tebogo stood there, unsure what would come next. She had crossed the line, broken the silence, stepped out of invisibility, and now there was no going back. The door closed behind Yusuf with a quiet click, but the silence he left behind was anything but quiet. It spread across the room, like a slow-burning fire, unseen but impossible to ignore. No one spoke, no one moved. For a moment it felt as though time itself had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. And at the center of it all stood Tebogo. No longer invisible, no longer just a waitress. Now something else, something dangerous. Sibusiso was the first to react. He leaned forward, both hands flat on the polished table, his voice low but sharp with restrained anger. "This is unacceptable." Every word was controlled, but beneath it was something boiling. You allow an untrained staff member to interrupt a high-level negotiation, accuse a professional, and disrupt a deal of this magnitude. His gaze flicked briefly to Tebogo, not as a person, as a problem, a mistake that needed to be corrected. Mrs. Kumalo straightened immediately, stepping forward again, her face tight with tension. "I deeply apologize, sir," she said quickly. "This will be handled. Tebogo, leave, now." The command was quiet, but absolute, the kind that carried consequences Tebogo knew too well. Her stomach tightened. This was it. The moment after courage, the moment where reality returned. She had spoken, and now she would pay for it. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides. She opened her mouth to respond. To stay. The voice cut through everything. Sheikh Karim, not loud, not emotional, but firm enough to stop the entire room again. Mrs. Kumalo froze. Sibusiso turned his head slowly, disbelief flickering across his face. "I'm sorry," Sibusiso said. "She stays." Sheikh Karim repeated his tone, calm but unyielding. A beat passed, then another, because no one in that room was used to being contradicted like that. Not by someone with less power, not in front of others. Sibusiso leaned back slowly, studying Sheikh Karim with a new level of caution. With respect, he said carefully, "This is a business negotiation, not a training exercise. We cannot allow what we cannot allow." Sheikh Karim interrupted gently, "Is a negotiation built on incorrect information." The words were not aggressive, but they carried truth, and truth had a way of cutting deeper than anger. The room shifted again. Sibusiso's jaw tightened. He didn't like this, not at all, but he also understood something important. This deal mattered more than his pride, and right now, Sheikh Karim was no longer fully on his side. That changed everything. Tebogo stood still, her heart pounding. She didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe too loudly. Because somehow, she had been pulled into a space she was never meant to enter, and she didn't yet understand the rules. Sheikh Karim turned slightly in his chair, now facing her more directly. "What is your name?" he asked. The question felt strange, out of place, like being asked who you were in the middle of a storm. "Tebogo," she said softly. "Tebogo," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "Stay." It wasn't a request, it was a decision, and just like that, her fate in that moment changed. Mrs. Kumalo stepped back slowly, confusion and tension written across her face. She didn't argue, but her eyes said everything. This is not over, not even close. The meeting resumed, but nothing about it felt the same. The balance had shifted, subtly but permanently. Without Yusuf, the flow of conversation faltered for a moment. Assistants exchanged uncertain glances. Someone flipped through documents too quickly. Then Sheikh Karim spoke again, in Arabic, clear, measured, intentional. And this time all eyes turned to Tebogo, her breath caught. She hadn't expected this. Not like this. Not so soon. He was testing her. Not just her knowledge, her composure, her courage, her place in this room. The weight of every gaze pressed down on her again. Sibusiso watched her closely now, not dismissive anymore, evaluating, calculating. If she failed, she would confirm every doubt, every judgment, every reason she should never have spoken. Tebogo swallowed, her throat felt dry, but she stepped forward anyway. Just one step, enough to be heard, not enough to feel safe. She translated, carefully, slowly, choosing her words with precision. Not just translating language, but meaning. Exactly as her father had taught her. The room listened, truly listened, for the first time since she had entered. When she finished, silence followed. But this silence was different, not heavy with tension, but filled with something else. Recognition. Sheikh Karim nodded slightly. Again he said, another sentence. Longer this time. More complex. Tebogo listened, her mind focused. Her fear, still there but no longer in control. She translated again, more confidently now, clear, accurate, steady. Sibusiso leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. Because now, this was no longer a disruption. This was proof, and proof was difficult to ignore. The meeting began to rebuild itself, piece by piece, with Tebogo as the bridge. Every sentence passed through her, every meaning clarified, every hidden edge removed, and, slowly, the trust that had almost been broken began to return, but not in the same way, not blindly, not easily. Because now everyone in that room knew something they hadn't known before, that power could be challenged. That truth could come from unexpected places. That even a waitress could change the outcome of $1 million deal. Time passed. Minutes, maybe an hour. Tebogo lost track. All she knew was that she was still standing, still speaking, still being heard. And that alone felt unreal. Finally, the discussion slowed. The documents were adjusted, clauses rewritten, terms clarified, and when the final version of the agreement was placed on the table, it felt different, fair, balanced, real. Sibusiso picked up his pen again. This time there was no hesitation, no tension, only careful acceptance. He signed, then passed the document across the table. Sheikh Karim reviewed it briefly, then signed as well. The deal was done. But not the way it was supposed to be. Not the way it had been planned. Because one voice, one unexpected voice, had changed everything. The room began to move again. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, assistants exhaled, the world returned. But Tebogo remained where she was. Still, quiet, unsure. Because now came the part she had been afraid of all along. The consequences. She lowered her eyes slightly, waiting. For anger, for dismissal, for reality to return and remind her who she was. But instead, she heard footsteps, slow, measured, coming toward her. She looked up and saw Sheikh Karim standing in front of her. Not above her, not beyond her. In front of her, up close. His presence felt even stronger, but not threatening. Focused. You changed the outcome of this meeting, he said. Not praise, not surprise, just fact. Tebogo didn't know what to say. So, she said nothing. He studied her for a moment, then asked the question that would change everything again. Do you know what you risked? Tebogo nodded slowly. Yes. And you still spoke. A pause. Yes. Another silence, but this one felt different, lighter. Almost like something was beginning. Sheikh Karim's expression softened just slightly. Then he said, good. Just one word. But it carried something Tebogo had not felt in a very long time. Respect. And in that moment, for the first time since she stepped into that hotel, Tebogo was no longer invisible. The word stayed with her. Good. It echoed in Tebogo's mind long after Sheikh Karim turned away, and the room began to return to its usual rhythm of controlled professionalism. Good. Such a small word. But for someone like her, it felt unfamiliar, heavy, almost dangerous. Because praise in her world was never simple. It came with expectations, with consequences, with attention. And attention was something Tebogo had spent years avoiding. The meeting had ended, but its impact lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Staff moved quickly to clear the table, gather documents, and reset the room as though nothing unusual had happened. As though a waitress had not just stepped into $1 million negotiation and changed its outcome. As though Tebogo had not just crossed a line that most people in her position never even saw. Tebogo. The voice came from behind her. Sharp, controlled. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Mrs. Kumalo. Tebogo closed her eyes briefly before facing her. Yes, ma'am. There was no warmth in Mrs. Kumalo's expression, only tension, and something else, disapproval. Come with me. No explanation, no raised voice, just that, which somehow felt worse. Tebogo followed her out of the VIP lounge, her steps quiet against the polished floor, her mind racing again, but differently now. Not fear of speaking, but fear of what came after. They stopped in a narrow corridor behind the service area, away from guests, away from eyes, away from anything that required politeness. Mrs. Kumalo turned to face her. You embarrassed me. The words were quiet, but they landed hard. Tebogo lowered her gaze. I'm sorry. Sorry, Mrs. Kumalo repeated, her voice tightening. Do you understand what you did in there? Tebogo hesitated, because yes, she did, but not in the way Mrs. Kumalo meant. I spoke out of turn, she said carefully. You disrupted a high-level meeting, Mrs. Kumalo corrected sharply. You risked this hotel's reputation. You overstepped your position. Each word felt like a step pushing her back into the place she came from. Small, controlled, replaceable. Tebogo nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. And what gave you the right? Mrs. Kumalo continued, her voice lowering even more, to insert yourself into something that had nothing to do with you. That question lingered, because it was the real one. Not about rules, not about protocol, about worth, about place, about who gets to speak and who doesn't. Tebogo swallowed. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she said quietly. You just what Mrs. Kumalo cut in. Tebogo paused. Her heart beat faster again, this time not from fear of the room, but from something deeper. Because now she had to answer not as a waitress, but as herself. I understood what was being said, she said softly. And it wasn't true. A long silence followed. Mrs. Kumalo stared at her, really stared, as if trying to see something she had missed before. You speak Arabic? She asked finally. A little. A little. Mrs. Kumalo repeated, disbelief creeping into her tone. You just corrected a professional interpreter in front of billionaires, and you call that a little. Tebogo didn't respond, because she didn't know how to explain something that had never been meant for this world. Mrs. Kumalo exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of her nose. This is not about what you know, she said. It's about boundaries. There are lines, Tebogo, and you crossed one today. The words were firm, final, and familiar. Lines. There were always lines. Invisible ones, unspoken ones, unfair ones. Tebogo nodded again. I understand. Do you? Mrs. Kumalo asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Because understanding means knowing that actions have consequences. Tebogo's stomach tightened. Here it comes. This could cost you your job, Mrs. Kumalo said quietly. The words hung in the air. Not shouted, not dramatic, just real. Tebogo felt it immediately. The weight, the reality, the truth she had already prepared herself for. Her room, her rent, her survival, all tied to this job, and now at risk, because she chose to speak. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. I understand, she repeated, and this time she meant it fully. Mrs. Kumalo watched her for a moment longer, waiting, expecting something, fear, begging, regret. But Tebogo didn't offer any of that. Not because she didn't feel it, but because something inside her had already changed, and she couldn't undo it, not even if she wanted to. Mrs. Kumalo sighed. This isn't over, she said finally. Go back to work. Tebogo blinked. She hadn't expected that. Not yet. Yes, ma'am. She turned to leave. Her legs felt steady, but her thoughts were not. Because uncertainty was worse than punishment. At least punishment had an ending. This was waiting. She returned to the main floor. Everything looked the same. Guests walking, staff moving, conversations flowing. But to Tebogo, everything felt different, because now she knew something she hadn't known before. That the world could shift, that silence could be broken, that she could be seen, and that, once seen, you could never fully go back to being invisible again. Tebogo. This time the voice was unfamiliar, deep, calm. She turned slowly, and there he was, Sheikh Karim, standing a few steps away from her. Alone, no assistance, no entourage, just him. For a moment she didn't move, didn't speak, because this wasn't supposed to happen. People like him didn't approach people like her. Not directly, not personally, not like this. But he did. "I have a question for you," he said. Tebogo nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." He studied her face briefly, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt deliberate. "Measured. You said you learned Arabic from your father," he continued. "Yes. Is he still teaching?" The question hit unexpectedly. Tebogo's chest tightened. "No, sir." A pause. "He passed away." Sheikh Karim nodded slowly. "I see." There was no pity in his expression, no empty sympathy, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that felt more respectful. Another moment passed. Then he said something that shifted everything again. "I would like you to translate something for me." Tebogo blinked. "Here now." "Yes, sir," she said cautiously. He spoke in Arabic, not slowly, not simplified, naturally, fluently. The sentence was longer than before, more complex, layered. It wasn't just a test of language. It was a test of understanding, of nuance, of confidence. Tebogo listened carefully. Every word, every pause, every intention. Her mind moved quickly, but calmly, and when he finished, she translated, clearly, accurately, without hesitation. Sheikh Karim didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her. Then he spoke again. Another sentence, even more complex. Tebogo repeated the process. Listening, understanding, translating. This time there was no fear in her voice, only focus. When she finished, the silence that followed felt different. Not tense, not uncertain, but conclusive. Like a decision had just been made. Sheikh Karim gave a small nod, then said, "You are better than a little." The words caught her off guard, because they weren't exaggerated, they weren't dramatic, they were precise. And coming from him, that mattered. Tebogo felt something shift inside her again. Not pride, not yet, but something close to it, something unfamiliar, something growing. Sheikh Karim took a step back, then said, "Tell me, Tebogo, how long do you plan to remain invisible?" The question landed softly, but it echoed deeply, because it wasn't really about her job, or the hotel, or even this moment. It was about something much bigger. Tebogo didn't answer right away, because she didn't have one. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to. The question lingered, long after Sheikh Karim spoke it. "How long do you plan to remain invisible?" It wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful, but it stayed with Tebogo in a way no command ever had, because it wasn't telling her what to do. It was asking her who she wanted to be. For a moment she said nothing, because how do you answer a question you've never allowed yourself to think about? Her life had never been about choice. It had been about survival, one day at a time, one shift at a time, one silent step after another, invisible, safe, contained. But now, that word felt different, smaller, like something she had outgrown without realizing it. "I don't know, sir," she said honestly, and for the first time she didn't feel ashamed of not having an answer. Sheikh Karim studied her for a moment, Then he gave a slight nod, as if her honesty confirmed something he had already suspected. "Good," he said again. There was that word, but this time, it meant something else. Not approval, possibility. He glanced briefly around the hotel lobby, people moving, conversations flowing, a world continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Then he looked back at her. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't an order either. It felt different. Tebogo hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. They walked side by side toward a quieter part of the hotel, away from the main lobby, past a row of tall glass windows that overlooked the city. Johannesburg stretched out beyond the glass. Busy, alive, unforgiving. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt intentional. Then Sheikh Karim stopped, turned slightly, and faced her fully. "Do you enjoy working here?" he asked. The question seemed simple, but Tebogo knew better. There were questions that tested knowledge, and there were questions that tested truth. This was the second kind. She looked down briefly, then back up. "It pays my rent," she said. Not a complaint, not a lie, just reality. A faint shift crossed his expression. Not disappointment, understanding. And beyond that, Tebogo hesitated, because beyond that, there wasn't much. Long hours, little recognition, constant reminders of where she stood and where she didn't. But saying that out loud felt dangerous. "I'm grateful to have a job," she said carefully. Sheikh Karim held her gaze. "You didn't answer the question." Her chest tightened slightly. Because he was right. And he wasn't letting her hide behind safe answers. Tebogo exhaled slowly, then quietly, "No." The word felt heavier than she expected, but also lighter, because it was the truth. Sheikh Karim nodded once. "Good." Again, that word. But now it carried something sharper. Clarity. He took a step closer. Not invading her space, but closing the distance enough to make his next words matter more. "You have a skill," he said, "one that people spend years trying to acquire." Tebogo said nothing. "You understand language," he continued. "Not just words, but meaning. That is rare." A pause. "And you used it today." Tebogo swallowed. "I just said what I heard." "No," he corrected gently. "You chose to speak when silence was safer." That landed differently, because it was true. And hearing it said out loud made it real in a way she couldn't ignore. He studied her for a moment longer. "Then I need someone like that." The words hung in the air, unclear, open. Tebogo blinked. "I don't understand." "I'm offering you a position," Sheikh Karim said calmly. "Working with me." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Just a fraction, but enough. Tebogo stared at him, processing, trying to understand what he meant. Working with him. No, that didn't make sense. That didn't happen. Not to people like her. "I'm just a waitress," she said almost automatically. Sheikh Karim's expression didn't change. "That is your current job," he replied. "Not your limit." The words hit deeper than anything else he had said, because they challenged something Tebogo had accepted for years without question. Limit. She had never thought of it like that. Not consciously, but she had lived it. Every day, every shift, every silent step, her world had boundaries, clear ones, fixed ones. And now he was asking her to step beyond them. Her heart began to race again. Not from fear, not exactly, but from something unfamiliar, something bigger. "What kind of position?" she asked slowly. "A translator," he said, "and more than that, a liaison. Someone I can trust in negotiations across Africa." Trust. The word felt heavy, unfamiliar, powerful. Tebogo's thoughts spun. This wasn't just a job. This was a different life, a different world. Meetings, travel, responsibility, visibility, everything she had avoided, everything she had never imagined for herself. "I don't have experience," she said quickly. "You have ability," he replied. "Experience can be built. I didn't finish school. You can learn. I don't belong in that world." This time, he paused. Because that answer, that one mattered most. "Who told you that?" he asked quietly. Tebogo froze, because the answer was complicated. No one had said it directly, not in those words. But it had been shown, every day, in looks, in tone, in opportunity, in absence of opportunity. "No one," she said. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Sheikh Karim nodded slowly. "Then perhaps," he said, "it is time you decide for yourself." The silence that followed felt different again. Not heavy, not tense, but full. Full of something, waiting to be chosen. Tebogo looked out through the glass windows again. At the city, at the life she knew, the struggle, the routine, the certainty of it. Then she looked back at him. At the uncertainty he was offering. The risk, the unknown, the possibility. Her chest tightened, because this wasn't just a decision about a job. This was a decision about who she would become. If she said yes, everything would change. If she said no, nothing would. And for the first time, that felt like the bigger risk. She began, then stopped, because fear was still there, still real, still loud, but it no longer felt like the only voice. She took a breath, then another, and finally, "I need time," she said. Not a rejection, not yet, just honesty. Sheikh Karim nodded. "I expected that." He reached into his pocket and handed her a simple card. No flash, no excess, just a name, a number. "Call me," he said, "when you decide." Tebogo took it carefully, as if it might disappear, or break, or change everything just by being real. She looked at it, then back at him. "Why me?" she asked. The question slipped out before she could stop it. But this time she didn't regret it. Sheikh Karim's answer came without hesitation. "Because you chose truth over safety." A pause. And people like that are rare. He turned to leave, then stopped briefly. Without looking back, he added, "Do not wait too long, Tebogo. Opportunities do not remain where they are not claimed." And then he walked away. Just like that, leaving her standing there, with a card in her hand and a decision that would change everything. Tebogo looked down at the card again. Her fingers tightened slightly around it. Invisible. That was who she had been. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to be anymore. The card felt heavier than it should. It was just paper. Simple, clean, unremarkable. But in Tebogo's hand, it carried the weight of two completely different futures. She stood by the glass window, long after Sheikh Karim had walked away, her reflection faint against the bright Johannesburg skyline. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her, because something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. "Tebogo," the voice snapped her back. One of the junior waitresses. Naledi rushed toward her, eyes wide with barely contained excitement. "What did he say to you?" Naledi whispered, glancing around like they were sharing a dangerous secret. "Everyone is talking. You were with him. Alone." Tebogo blinked. Reality rushed back in. The hotel, the uniform, the life she knew. "Nothing," she said quickly. Naledi frowned. "Nothing," she repeated clearly, unconvinced. "You interrupted. A meeting got the interpreter fired. And now the man himself is walking around asking for you, and you're saying nothing." Tebogo tightened her grip on the card, slipping it discreetly into her apron pocket. "It's not like that," she said. Naledi leaned closer. "Then what is it like?" Tebogo hesitated, because she didn't have the words yet, not for something that felt this big. Asked me a question, she said finally. Naledi stared at her. You are a terrible liar. Tebogo almost smiled. Almost. But the moment passed quickly. Because beneath Naledi's curiosity was something else, something Tebogo recognized all too well. Distance. Not yet, but coming. Because once people realized you were no longer where they thought you belonged, they treated you differently, either above them or outside them, rarely beside them. Tebogo Naledi said more quietly, Now be careful. The shift in tone caught her attention. What do you mean? Naledi glanced around again before lowering her voice. People don't like it when someone like us suddenly stands out. The words were soft, but they carried truth. The kind of truth that didn't need explanation. Tebogo nodded slowly. I know. And she did, more than Naledi realized, because she could already feel it, in the way some staff members looked at her now, too long, too curious, too sharp, and others avoided her completely, as if whatever had happened in that room might somehow spread. Anyway, Naledi said, forcing a lighter tone, Mrs. Kumalo is looking for you again. Of course she was. Tebogo exhaled slowly. Thank you. Naledi squeezed her arm briefly before stepping away. But the warning lingered. Be careful. Tebogo walked back through the corridors, each step heavier than before. Because now she wasn't just carrying trays. She was carrying a decision. One she couldn't ignore. One she couldn't delay forever. Mrs. Kumalo was waiting in the service office this time. The door was closed. That was never a good sign. Tebogo knocked lightly. Come in. She stepped inside. Mrs. Kumalo sat behind a small desk, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Close the door. Tebogo did. The click echoed louder than it should. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Do you understand what happened today? Mrs. Kumalo asked. The question again. Different tone. Same weight. Yes, ma'am. And what exactly do you think happened? She pressed. Tebogo hesitated, because this answer mattered, not just for the moment, but for what came next. I interrupted a meeting, she said carefully, and corrected a mistake. Mrs. Kumalo's eyes narrowed slightly. A mistake, she repeated. Tebogo held her gaze. A lie. Silence. This time, longer, more deliberate. Mrs. Kumalo leaned back slightly in her chair. You speak differently now, she said. Tebogo didn't respond, because she didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but she felt it. Something had changed. I received a call, Mrs. Kumalo continued, from management. Tebogo's stomach tightened. Here it comes. They are aware of what happened, she said. And they are impressed. Tebogo blinked. Impressed. That was not the word she expected, but Mrs. Kumalo added, her tone sharpening slightly. That does not erase the fact that you broke protocol. Of course, there was always a balance, always a price. You are not being dismissed, she said. Relief hit quickly, then confusion. Not dismissed. However, Mrs. Kumalo continued. You are being reassigned, temporarily, to what Tebogo asked, to assist with VIP communications when required. The words took a moment to settle. This wasn't punishment, not entirely. But it wasn't exactly a reward either. It was something in between. A test. You will still perform your regular duties, Mrs. Kumalo added. But when needed, you will be called. Tebogo nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Kumalo watched her carefully. Tell me something, Tebogo. Yes, did he offer you something? The question hit directly. Too directly. Tebogo's heart skipped a beat. She hesitated. Just long enough. Mrs. Kumalo noticed. He did, she said quietly. Not a question. A statement. Tebogo lowered her gaze. I don't know yet. Mrs. Kumalo leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me carefully," she said. Her voice was no longer sharp. It was something else, serious, measured. Opportunities like that, they are not simple. Tebogo looked up. "They come with expectations," Mrs. Kumalo continued. "With pressure, with risks you cannot yet see." A pause. "And they do not always end well." The warning was clear, but it wasn't bitter. It wasn't jealous. It sounded experienced. Tebogo felt a shift. Because for the first time she wasn't just being corrected. She was being cautioned. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Kumalo held her gaze. "Because I have seen girls like you before." Tebogo's chest tightened. "And they either rise," she said, "or they disappear completely." The words settled heavily between them. No comfort, no guarantee, just truth. Tebogo nodded slowly. "I understand." Mrs. Kumalo leaned back again. "Do you?" Tebogo paused. Then yes. And this time, she meant something different. She didn't understand everything. Not yet. But she understood enough. Enough to know that this decision, this moment would define more than just her job. It would define her direction. "You may go," Mrs. Kumalo said, finally. Tebogo turned to leave. Her hand paused on the door handle. Then she spoke. "Ma'am, yes. Have you ever been given a choice like this?" Mrs. Kumalo didn't answer immediately. For a moment, her expression shifted, subtly. Then she said yes. A beat, and I said no. Tebogo turned slightly. "Do you regret it?" Silence. Long, honest. Then every day. The answer landed softly, but deeply. Tebogo nodded once, then left the room. The corridor felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She walked slowly back toward the main floor, her hand slipping into her apron pocket. Her fingers found the card again, held it, tight, invisible. That had been her safety, her shield, her identity. But now it felt like something she might have to let go of. Not all at once, not easily, but inevitably. She stepped back into the light of the hotel. The noise, the movement, the life she knew. But this time she wasn't just passing through it. She was standing at the edge of something new. And for the first time, the question wasn't whether she could survive. It was whether she was ready to change. That night, long after her shift ended and the noise of the Royal Crescent Hotel faded behind her, Tebogo walked home slower than usual, as if each step needed more time to decide which direction her life was truly moving toward, because for the first time in years, the road ahead did not feel already decided for her, and that alone made everything feel unfamiliar in a way that was both frightening and strangely alive. The streets of Johannesburg were still busy, filled with people chasing their own survival, vendors closing stalls, taxis calling out destinations, and the distant hum of a city that never truly paused. Yet Tebogo moved through it all like someone caught between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to the one she had always known, but not yet brave enough to step into the one that had suddenly opened before her. Her fingers tightened inside her pocket, pressing against the small card Sheikh Karim had given her, as though holding onto it might somehow make the decision clearer. But instead, it only made the weight of it more real, because that card was no longer just paper. It was a question, a challenge, and a door that would not remain open forever. By the time she reached her building, the night air had grown colder, and the familiar sight of cracked walls and dim stairways should have brought comfort. But instead it felt smaller than it ever had before, as though the life she had once fought so hard just to survive was now asking her whether survival alone was enough. Inside her room, everything was exactly as she had left it. A narrow bed, a small table, a single chair, and a window that barely let in enough light. But tonight, the space felt different. Not because it had changed, but because she had. And that realization settled into her chest in a way she could not ignore. She sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, pulling the card out and placing it on the table in front of her. staring at it for a long time without touching it again. Because somehow, as long as it stayed there untouched, the decision itself could be delayed, suspended between what was and what could be. Her mind drifted back to her father, not as a memory this time, but as a presence that felt closer than it had in years. His voice echoing in the quiet room, reminding her of nights when they sat together, learning words that had once seemed meaningless yet had now become the very thing standing between her old life and something entirely new. "You must decide who you are," he had told her once, his tone gentle but unwavering, and at the time she had thought he was speaking about small things, about character, about choices within the life she already knew. But now she understood that he had been preparing her for something much bigger, something like this. Tebogo leaned back slightly, her eyes closing for a moment as exhaustion finally caught up with her. But sleep did not come easily, because every time she allowed her thoughts to settle, they returned to the same place, the same question, the same impossible feeling that she was standing on the edge of a life she had never imagined she could have. What if she failed? The thought came quietly, but it stayed. What if she accepted the offer, stepped into that world, and realized she didn't belong there after all? What if everything she believed about herself, that she was just a waitress, just someone meant to survive, quietly was not something she could simply leave behind? Her chest tightened. Failure in her world was not just embarrassment. It was collapse. It meant losing everything. But then, another thought followed, slower, deeper, more difficult to ignore. What if she didn't try? That question felt heavier, because it didn't just ask about risk, it asked about regret. And suddenly, she thought of Mrs. Kumalo's voice. Earlier that day, calm, but filled with something Tebogo had not expected: truth. "Do you regret it every day?" The words echoed now louder than before, settling into her mind, in a way that made it impossible to dismiss them as just a passing warning. Because regret was something Tebogo understood far too well. Not from missed opportunities, but from moments where she had chosen silence, where she had allowed fear to decide for her, where she had watched life happen around her, instead of stepping into it. She opened her eyes again, her gaze returning to the card on the table, and this time she reached for it slowly, her fingers brushing against its edges as though testing whether it was still real. And when she finally picked it up, she felt something shift inside her. Not certainty, not confidence, but something quieter, something steadier. A decision, not fully formed, not yet spoken. But there, she stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the city lights stretching endlessly into the distance, each one representing a life, a story, a path that had been chosen or forced or fought for. And for the first time she allowed herself to imagine that maybe her story did not have to remain the same. That maybe it could change, that maybe she could change it. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, not as the girl who had learned to survive by staying invisible, but as someone standing at the beginning of something she did not yet understand. And though fear was still there, still present, still real, it no longer felt like the only thing guiding her. She took a slow breath, then another, and as she stood there holding that card in her hand, Tebogo realized something that felt both terrifying and freeing at the same time. Her life was no longer waiting for permission. It was waiting for her. The next morning did not feel like a new beginning. It felt heavier than that. It felt like standing at the edge of something that could either lift her into a life she had never imagined or pull everything she had built apart in a way she could not recover from. And as Tebogo stepped out into the early light of Johannesburg, the city looked the same as it always had. But she no longer moved through it the same way, because now every familiar street, every passing face, every ordinary moment seemed to carry a quiet question beneath it. Is this still enough for you? She had barely slept, Not because she didn't try, but because every time her mind began to rest, it circled back to the same place, the card, the offer, the risk. And though she had not said the decision out loud yet, something inside her had already begun to lean toward it slowly, carefully, like a door opening just enough to let possibility through. When she reached the hotel, nothing appeared different on the surface. Yet the shift was immediate the moment she stepped inside, because people noticed her now in a way they hadn't before. Not openly, not with admiration, but with curiosity that lingered, just a little too long, with whispers that softened when she passed, with glances that carried questions no one asked directly. And though she kept her posture steady and her expression calm, she could feel it all pressing lightly against her like a reminder that once you step out of invisibility, you cannot control how the world chooses to see you. Naledi spotted her first. "You didn't call him, did you?" she asked in a low voice, walking quickly beside her as they moved toward the staff area. Tebogo shook her head slightly, though the answer felt incomplete. "Not yet." Naledi studied her face for a moment, as if trying to read something deeper beneath her calm. "You're thinking about it." It wasn't a question. Tebogo didn't deny it. "I have to," she said quietly, because pretending otherwise would have been a lie she no longer felt comfortable telling, not after everything that had happened. Naledi exhaled slowly. "Just don't lose yourself." She said, her tone softer now, more protective than before, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight Tebogo understood, because in their world, change did not always mean growth. Sometimes it meant being pulled into something that reshaped you until you no longer recognized who you were. "I won't," Tebogo replied, though she wasn't entirely sure how that promise would hold once everything began to move. Their conversation ended as they entered the staff area, where the usual routine resumed, trays being prepared, uniforms adjusted, instructions given. But even as Tebogo moved through the motions she had performed hundreds of times before, something inside her refused to settle back into the same rhythm, because now she knew that this routine, this life, was no longer the only path available to her, and that knowledge made everything feel temporary. Mid-morning came quickly, and with it another call for VIP service. But this time, when Mrs. Kumalo approached her, there was a subtle difference in the way she spoke. Not softer, not warmer, but more measured, as though she was still deciding how to position Tebogo within a structure that no longer fit her quite the same way. "You'll assist in conference room B," she said, her eyes briefly holding Tebogo's, searching for something she didn't name, and Tebogo nodded without hesitation. Because whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she had met everything else, with quiet focus and a willingness to step forward when needed. The meeting itself was smaller, less intense than the one from the previous day. But the moment Tebogo entered, she could feel the difference, because the people in that room had already heard about her, about what she had done, about the waitress who spoke up, and though no one said it directly, their attention lingered on her in a way that made it clear she was no longer just part of the background. "Is she the one man whispered to another, not quietly enough. Tebogo heard it. Of course she did, but she didn't react, because reacting would mean acknowledging something she was not yet ready to define. The conversation began, and though there was no formal interpreter present, there were moments when language shifted, when clarity blurred slightly, and this time without hesitation, one of the managers turned to her. "Tebogo, could you clarify that it was a simple request?" But it changed everything, because this time she wasn't interrupting, she was being asked. She stepped forward slightly, her voice steady as she translated, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but accurately enough to bridge the gap, and as she spoke, she felt something settle inside her. Not confidence exactly, but alignment, as though the skill she had carried quietly for so long had finally found a place where it was allowed to exist. The meeting continued, smoother now, clearer, and when it ended, there was no dramatic reaction. No applause, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had worked better than expected. And as Tebogo stepped back into the corridor, she realized that the world had already begun to shift around her, slowly, almost invisibly but undeniably. By midday, the decision she had been holding inside her could no longer remain unspoken. It pressed against her thoughts, her movements, her breath. So when her break came, she didn't go to the staff room. She didn't sit. She didn't wait. Instead, she walked outside. The sun was higher now, the city louder, the air warmer, and for a moment she simply stood there, letting the noise of life surround her, grounding her in something real before she reached into her pocket and pulled out the card once more. Her fingers traced the edges. Her heart beat faster, not from fear alone, but from something else, something that felt like movement. She looked at the number, then at the street ahead, then back at the number again. This was it. There would be no perfect moment, no complete certainty, no guarantee, only a choice. Tebogo took a slow breath, then lifted her phone, her fingers hesitating for only a fraction of a second, before dialing, and as the line began to ring, each second stretched longer than it should have, each sound echoing louder in her chest until finally it connected. This is Kareem. His voice was calm, recognizable, certain. Tebogo closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, grounding herself in the moment. "It's Tebogo," she said. A pause. "Not long, but enough." "I was expecting your call," he replied. Something in her chest tightened. Not from pressure, but from the realization that this had always been real, that this moment had always been coming. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice steady, now clearer than she expected it to be. "Go on." Another breath. Another second. Then yes. The word felt simple, but it carried everything. Silence followed. Not empty, but full, and when Sheikh Kareem spoke again, there was something new in his tone. Not surprise, not relief, but recognition. "Then we begin." Tebogo lowered the phone, slowly, after the call ended, her hand, still slightly trembling, but her mind steady because the decision had been made. The line had been crossed, and whatever came next would no longer be something she imagined. From a distance, it would be something she lived. She looked up at the city again. The same streets, the same people, the same life, but not the same Tebogo. Because for the first time, she had not chosen safety. She had chosen change, and there was no going back from that. The moment Tebogo ended the call, something inside her settled. Not in the way fear disappears, but in the way a decision removes the endless noise of uncertainty, replacing it with something quieter, something heavier, something that demanded action, because now there was no more wondering what might happen. There was only what would. She returned to the hotel differently, not visibly, not dramatically. Her uniform was the same, her posture steady, her steps measured. But internally there was a shift that could not be undone, as though she had stepped out of a version of herself that had been shaped by limitation and into one that would now be defined by choice, even if that choice led her into discomfort, into pressure, into a world that would not welcome her easily. Because she understood something clearly, now opportunity did not erase struggle. It changed its form. By the time she re-entered the staff corridor, the news had already begun to move faster than she expected, because spaces like these, where people observed more than they spoke, had their own way of spreading truth, bending it, reshaping it until it returned as something sharper than before. She called him. The whisper came from somewhere behind her. She said yes. Another voice. "They say she's leaving." Tebogo didn't turn. She didn't respond, but she heard everything. And she understood immediately. The shift had begun. Naledi found her again near the service station, her expression more serious this time, no longer just curious, but searching, as though trying to understand what Tebogo's decision meant. not just for her, but for everyone around her. "You accepted it," she said quietly. Tebogo nodded. "Yes." Naledi exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, and though there was no resentment in her expression, there was something else. Distant, subtle, but real, the beginning of a separation. Neither of them had chosen, but both could feel. "That's," Big Naledi said. "It is." A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but different, because something unspoken had shifted, something that neither of them knew how to name yet, and Tebogo realized in that moment that growth did not only change your life, it changed your relationships, your place, your connection to the people who had once stood beside you in the same struggle. "When do you leave?" Naledi asked. "I don't know yet." Naledi nodded slowly. "Just remember where you came from." The words were gentle, but they carried weight. Tebogo met her eyes. "I won't forget." Naledi gave a small nod. But the moment had already changed, and as she stepped away, Tebogo felt it clearly for the first time. Not loss exactly, but distance forming where closeness once lived, and though it wasn't painful yet, she knew it would be. Because moving forward often meant leaving something behind. By the afternoon, the shift became more visible. Managers who had once spoken to her with casual authority now measured their words more carefully, their tone shifting just enough to reveal uncertainty because they no longer knew how to place her. Was she still staff, still beneath them, still expected to follow without question, or had she already begun to move into something else? Mrs. Kumalo called her again, before the end of the shift. This time the door remained slightly open. A small difference, but not accidental. "Tebogo," she said, her voice controlled as always, though there was something beneath it, something quieter, more reflective. "Yes, ma'am. I hear you've made your decision." It wasn't a question. Tebogo nodded. "Yes." Mrs. Kumalo watched her for a moment longer than usual, as though trying to reconcile the girl she had trained to move silently through rooms with the woman now standing in front of her, someone who had spoken up, been heard and chosen something beyond the structure that had defined her role until now. "When do you leave?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet." Another pause. "Then you've done your work well here." The words were simple, but they carried something Tebogo had never received before. Acknowledgement. It didn't come with warmth, it didn't come with praise, but it was real. And that mattered. "Thank you," Tebogo said quietly. Mrs. Kumalo nodded once, then leaned back slightly, her gaze shifting for a moment as if considering something she rarely allowed herself to say. "The world you're stepping into," she said slowly, "it will not be kind to you." Tebogo listened. "Not because you don't belong there," she continued, "but because people will assume you don't." The truth in that statement settled deeply. "They will test you," Mrs. Kumalo added. "More than they test others. They will wait for you to fail. They will expect you to." A pause. "And when you don't, they will find other ways to challenge you." Tebogo felt the weight of those words fully, not as a warning meant to scare her, but as preparation. "Then I'll be ready," she said. Mrs. Kumalo's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "Good," she replied. There was that word again, but this time it felt different. Not from Sheikh Karim, not from opportunity, but from someone who understood the cost of choices made without fear. "You may go," she said. Tebogo nodded and stepped out, her mind quieter now. Not because the path ahead was clear, but because she had accepted that clarity was not required to move forward. That evening, as she left the hotel, the city felt louder than before, not in sound but in presence, because now every part of it seemed to reflect something back at her. Not just where she had been, but where she was going, and for the first time she did not feel like she was moving through it unnoticed. She was aware, present, seen. Her phone vibrated, a message, Unknown number. She opened it. Tomorrow, 9 a.m., my office. Come prepared. No greeting, no explanation. Just direction. Just expectation. She stared at the message for a moment, her heart tightening slightly because now the next step was real, no longer something she could delay or soften in her mind, and with it came a new kind of pressure. Not the fear of losing what she had, but the fear of not being enough for what was coming. That night she didn't sit for long. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she took out the few clothes she owned, selecting the most presentable ones, smoothing them carefully, preparing in the only way she knew how, because she understood something clearly. Now she could not control how that world would receive her, but she could control how she showed up, and that mattered. The next morning came quickly. Too quickly. The city was already alive when she stepped outside, but this time she didn't move like someone blending into it. She moved like someone stepping toward something, toward a test, toward a new version of herself, toward a world that would not accept her easily, but one she had already chosen. And as she walked forward, Tebogo realized something that steadied her more than anything else. She had already done the hardest part. She had said yes. Now, she would prove why that mattered. The building did not look like the kind of place where someone like Tebogo was meant to walk in without hesitation. And yet that morning, as she stood across the street, staring up at the glass structure, reflecting the rising Johannesburg sun, she understood that hesitation itself had become something she could no longer afford, because every second she delayed would only strengthen the voice inside her that still whispered she did not belong there, and she had already decided she would no longer let that voice decide her future. The headquarters of Kareem Holdings stood tall and precise, its entrance framed by polished stone and quiet security. The kind that did not shout authority but carried it in a way that made people lower their voices without realizing why. And as Tebogo stepped forward, her heart began to beat faster. Not from panic, but from awareness, because this was not a place she had ever imagined entering. Not as a guest, not as staff, and certainly not as someone expected. She paused only once at the entrance, adjusting her simple outfit, smoothing the fabric as if that small act could align her with a world that had always felt out of reach. And though she knew her clothes were modest compared to those who would pass through those doors, she also knew that what she carried inside her now mattered more than appearance, because skill, truth, and presence were not things that could be worn, they had to be lived. "Can I help you?" the security officer asked, his tone professional but curious. His eyes scanning her briefly, not with hostility but with the kind of quiet assessment that came from seeing someone who did not match the usual pattern. "I have a meeting," Tebogo replied, her voice steady even as her chest tightened slightly under his gaze. "With who, Mr. Kareem?" There was a pause, small but noticeable, because names like that did not come easily from people like her. The officer studied her for a moment longer, then checked his system, and when he looked back at her, something had changed. Not respect exactly, but recognition. "You're expected," he said. The words landed differently than she expected. Not relief. Something else. Responsibility. She nodded once and stepped inside. The interior was even more striking than the outside, clean lines. Glass walls, quiet movement, people, dressed with intention, carrying themselves with a confidence that came from knowing exactly where they belonged. And as Tebogo walked through the lobby, she could feel the difference immediately. Not just in how others moved, but in how they looked at her, because here she was not invisible, but she was not yet accepted either. She was being noticed, measured, placed somewhere between curiosity and doubt. A receptionist guided her toward the elevators, her tone polite but distant, and as Tebogo stepped inside, the doors closing softly behind her, she allowed herself a single breath to settle her thoughts, because everything from this moment forward would matter in ways she could not fully predict, and she needed to meet it not with fear but with presence. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped into a quieter floor, one that carried a different energy. Not louder, not busier but sharper, more focused, as though every conversation that happened there carried weight beyond the room itself. "Sheikh Karim is expecting you," a man said, gesturing toward a glass office at the far end. Tebogo nodded and walked forward, her steps steady, though her awareness heightened with every movement because now she could feel it clearly. This was not just a new place. This was a new level 1 where she would not be given space out of kindness, but would have to earn it with every word she spoke. She paused briefly at the door, then knocked. "Come in." His voice was the same, calm, certain, grounded. She stepped inside. The office was simple, in a way that only powerful spaces could be. No excess, no unnecessary decoration. Just clarity, purpose, and presence, and at the center of it Sheikh Karim sat behind a desk that did not need to impress anyone because the man behind it already did. He looked up as she entered. "You're on time," he said. "Yes, sir." "Good." There was that word again, but this time it felt like a standard. Not praise, expectation. He gestured toward the chair in front of him. "Sit." Tebogo sat carefully, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly together. Not stiff, not overly formal, but controlled, because she understood now that presence was not about appearing perfect. It was about being steady under pressure. For a moment he said nothing. He simply observed her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made it clear. This was the beginning of her evaluation. "You understand that yesterday was not the reason you are here," he said finally. Tebogo nodded. "Yes. Yesterday showed me what you might be," he continued. "Today tells me whether you are." The words were direct, unsoftened, and exactly what she needed. "I understand," she said. He leaned back slightly. "Good." Then, without further explanation, he began speaking in Arabic. Not slowly, not simplified, naturally, complex, layered. Tebogo listened carefully, her mind focusing immediately, not trying to translate word by word, but understanding the meaning beneath it, just as her father had taught her. Because language was not about replacing words, it was about carrying truth across them. When he finished, he looked at her. "Translate." She did, her voice steady, clear, measured, not rushed, not hesitant. She chose her words carefully, ensuring that the meaning remained intact, that nothing was lost, nothing distorted, nothing softened unnecessarily. When she finished, he nodded slightly. Then he spoke again. Longer, this time, more complex, introducing subtle shifts in tone, in implication, in meaning, as though testing not just her understanding, but her ability to navigate nuance, to recognize what was said and what was meant. Tebogo felt the pressure. Of course she did, but she did not let it control her. She listened, understood, then translated again, accurately, calmly, without apology. The room fell silent, not tense, not uncertain, but decisive, because something had just been proven. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Sheikh Karim leaned forward slightly. "You are capable," he said. Not praise, not surprise, just fact. Tebogo nodded. "Thank you." "But capability is not enough," he continued. She didn't respond, because she knew that already. "You will be tested," he said, "not only in language, but in judgment, in pressure, in loyalty." The words settled deeply. "You will be placed in rooms where people will assume you are the weakest person there," he added. A pause, "and they will be wrong." That sentence landed differently, because it wasn't encouragement, it was expectation. Tebogo felt something steady inside her. Not confidence, not yet, but alignment. "I won't prove them right," she said. A slight shift crossed his expression. Approval, barely visible, but there. "Good," he said. Then he stood. The movement signaled something. Not the end, the beginning. "Come," he said. Tebogo stood as well. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To your first real test," he replied. "No explanation, no details, just forward." And as she followed him out of that office, stepping into a world that would not pause for her, would not adjust for her, would not forgive hesitation, Tebogo realized something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about opportunity. It was about proving she deserved it. The conference room was already full when Tebogo stepped in, and the moment she crossed the threshold, she could feel it immediately, the shift in energy, the subtle tightening of attention, the quiet recalibration that happens when someone unexpected enters a space that was not designed with them in mind, because rooms like this carried their own hierarchy, their own invisible rules, and everyone inside them knew exactly where they stood, except her. The table stretched long across the room, lined with men and women whose presence spoke of experience, authority, and the kind of confidence that came from years of being heard without question. And as their eyes moved toward her, some briefly, some lingering, Tebogo understood that she was not being welcomed. She was being assessed, measured, not by what she had already done, but by what they expected her to fail at. "She's the one," someone murmured, not quite quietly enough. Another voice followed lower, sharper, "A waitress." The word landed not loudly, but precisely, like something placed exactly where it was meant to weaken her before she even spoke. And for a brief moment, the old instinct returned, the one that told her to shrink too, lower her gaze, to move quietly back into the edges where she would not be questioned. But she didn't, because she had already made that choice, and she was not going back. She walked forward, her posture steady, her movements controlled, not trying to prove anything, not trying to impress, but simply refusing to step backward. And as she reached the side of the table where Sheikh Karim stood, she felt something shift inside her. Not confidence, not yet, but something stronger than fear. "Begin," he said. That was all. No introduction, no explanation, no defense. He had placed her in that room without protection, which meant only one thing: he expected her to stand on her own. The discussion started quickly, moving at a pace that did not allow for hesitation, because this was not a controlled test, like the one in his office. This was real negotiation, layered with intention, strategy, and pressure. And as the first speaker began in Arabic, Tebogo felt the weight of every eye in the room shift toward her, waiting not for her to succeed, but for her to hesitate. She didn't. She listened carefully, her mind moving beyond words, capturing meaning, tone, implication. Then translated into English with clarity and precision. Her voice steady, neither too soft nor too forceful, just enough to carry authority without demanding it. And when she finished, the room remained quiet for a fraction longer than expected, not because she had impressed them, but because she had not failed. The next speaker leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but deliberate, and when he spoke, the complexity increased. Not just in language, but in intention, because this time there were subtle shifts, phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways, statements designed to test not just translation, but judgment. Tebogo understood immediately. This was not about language anymore. This was about control. If she translated too literally, she could weaken her side. If she adjusted too much, she could lose accuracy. Either way, she could be wrong. Her chest tightened slightly, but she didn't rush. She listened, fully. Then translated not just the words, but the meaning behind them, preserving the balance without distortion. And when she finished, one of the men across the table leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though reassessing something he had already decided about her. The pressure increased. Question after question, statement after statement, each one more layered than the last. And with each response, Tebogo felt the room testing her, pushing her, searching for the moment she would slip, the moment her inexperience would show, the moment they could confirm what they already believed, that she did not belong there. Then it happened. A senior executive spoke, his tone calm, but his words carefully constructed, embedding a clause that shifted responsibility in a way that was almost invisible unless you were listening for it. And as Tebogo process the sentence. She felt it immediately. That subtle shift, that imbalance hidden beneath polite language. If she translated it exactly as spoken, it would sound harmless. If she clarified it, she would be stepping beyond translation. Her mind raced. This was the line. The one she had crossed before. The one that had changed everything. She felt the room waiting, not visibly, but intentionally. Because moments like this revealed more than skill. They revealed courage. Her father's voice returned not as memory, but as truth. Meaning reveals truth. Tebogo took a breath. Then she translated. But this time she didn't stop at the surface. She added the necessary clarity, the underlying implication that exposed the shift in responsibility. Her voice steadied, her tone, neutral, not accusing. Not defensive, just clear enough that the meaning could not be ignored. The room reacted, subtly but unmistakably. A pause, a glance exchanged, a slight shift in posture, because now the statement could not pass unnoticed. The executive's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You are interpreting more than translating," he said, his voice calm but edged. The challenge was direct. The room quieted again. Tebogo felt the weight of it fully. This was the moment. If she stepped back now, she would protect herself. If she stood her ground, she would risk everything. Her heart pounded. But her voice did not. "I am preserving the meaning," she replied, meeting his gaze without aggression, without apology, just clarity. Silence followed. Not empty, but charged. Because now it was no longer about language. It was about authority. About who had the right to define what was being said. The executive held her gaze for a moment longer, then leaned back. The tension shifted, not resolved, but redirected. And just like that, she had not broken. The meeting continued, but the energy had changed because now Tebogo was no longer being tested as someone expected to fail. She was being engaged as someone who could not be easily dismissed, and though the skepticism had not disappeared, it had been forced to adjust. Time passed. The negotiation moved toward conclusion. Terms clarified, positions balanced, and when the final statements were made, there was no dramatic moment, no visible acknowledgement. Just a quiet understanding that something had been held together that might have otherwise slipped unnoticed. The room began to clear. Chairs moved, papers gathered, voices softened. But as Tebogo stepped back, allowing the space to return to its usual order, she felt something settle inside her. Not relief, not victory, but something steadier. Proof. Not to them, to herself. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting Sheikh Karim's across the room. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply held her gaze for a brief moment. And that was enough. Because she understood what it meant. You held. You did not break. As they left the room, walking back into the quiet corridor, the tension finally eased from her shoulders, but the weight of what had just happened remained. Because she knew this was only the beginning, that every room from now on would carry its own version of this test, its own pressure, its own expectation that she would eventually fail. But now she knew something she hadn't known before. She could stand in that pressure and not disappear. By the time Tebogo stepped out of the conference room, the quiet confidence she had carried through the negotiation did not feel like victory. And it certainly did not feel like safety, because something in the way the room had shifted subtly, carefully, almost invisibly, told her that what had just happened was not the end of a test, but the beginning of something far more complicated. Something that would not reveal itself immediately, but would instead unfold in ways designed to catch her when she was no longer expecting it. The corridor outside was calm. Almost too calm, the kind of stillness that follows something important but unresolved, and as she walked beside Sheikh Karim without speaking, she could feel that he too understood that the meeting had not simply been about negotiation, but about control, who held it, who lost it, and who had quietly interfered with it in a way that could not be ignored. "You saw it," he said, finally, his voice low, measured as though he did not need to explain what he meant. Tebogo nodded, her mind already replaying the moment when the clause had been introduced, when language had been used, not to communicate, but to conceal. "Yes." He glanced at her briefly. "Then you understand what comes next." She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't understand, but because understanding it meant accepting something she had only begun to see, that what she had uncovered was not an isolated attempt at manipulation, but part of a larger pattern, something intentional, something practiced, something that had likely succeeded many times before without anyone noticing. "They won't let it go," she said quietly. "No," he replied. "They won't." There was no fear in his tone, only certainty. They continued walking, moving through the building, with the same quiet authority he always carried. But this time, Tebogo felt it differently. Not as something distant that belonged only to him, but as something she was now standing close enough to feel the weight of, because being near power meant being near conflict, near resistance, near people who would not accept disruption without response. When they reached his office, he did not sit immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out over the city as though measuring something beyond the glass, and for a moment, Tebogo remained standing where she was unsure whether to speak or wait until he finally turned back toward her. "There is a reason that clause was hidden," he said. Tebogo nodded. "It shifts liability." "Yes," he said, stepping closer, his tone sharpening slightly. "But more than that, it creates dependency, which over time becomes control." The words settled heavily, because this was no longer about language. It was about power structures, about influence, about long-term consequence. "They've done this before," she said, the realization forming more clearly, now connecting pieces that had not fully aligned until this moment. "Yes," he replied, "and they expected to do it again." A pause followed, not empty, but deliberate, as though both of them were standing at the edge of the same understanding, one that could not be ignored, now that it had been seen. "What happens now?" Tebogo asked. He held her gaze for a moment, then said simply, "We verify." The word was calm, but it carried weight, because verification meant investigation, and investigation meant exposure. Within an hour, the atmosphere had shifted again, this time. Not in the open, but beneath the surface, as documents were requested, previous agreements reviewed, and communications pulled into focus, and Tebogo found herself seated across from a small team of analysts. Each one focused, precise, and already moving through data with the kind of efficiency that suggested this was not unfamiliar territory for them. "Walk us through what you heard," one of them said. Not dismissive, not questioning, but direct, as though her role here was already accepted. Tebogo nodded, her thoughts aligning as she began to explain. Not just the words, but the structure, the intention, the subtle shift that had turned fairness into imbalance, and as she spoke, she could see it happening the moment when understanding moved from abstract to concrete, when something that had once been hidden began to take shape in a way that could not be dismissed. "Here," another analyst said, pulling up a document on the screen, highlighting a clause that mirrored the one from the meeting, and suddenly it was no longer just a suspicion. It was a pattern, a deliberate one. "How many of these are there?" someone asked. "Too many," came the response. The room grew quieter, not with confusion, but with clarity, because now the scope was visible, and it was larger than expected. Tebogo sat back slightly, the realization settling deeper with each passing second, because what she had done in that meeting, what she had exposed, was not just a single act of dishonesty, but a small fracture in something much bigger. Something that had likely operated undetected for years, shaping deals, shifting power, influencing outcomes in ways no one had questioned. "You understand what this means," Sheikh Karim said, his voice cutting through the room, steady but firm. Yes, one of the analysts replied. If this is consistent across contracts, it's not just unethical, it's structural. Structural. The word carried weight, because it meant this wasn't a mistake, it was design. And design could not be ignored. Tebogo felt a quiet tension rise inside her, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, because exposing something like this did not come without consequence. And though she had not been the one to create the system, she had been the one to see through it, and that alone placed her in a position she could not step away from now. They'll push back, she said. Yes, Sheikh Karim replied. They'll deny it. Yes, they'll try to discredit it. A brief pause. And you, he said, meeting her eyes if necessary. The words were not meant to frighten her. They were meant to prepare her. And they did. Because she understood now more clearly than ever that truth did not protect itself. It required someone to stand with it, even when it became uncomfortable, even when it became dangerous. Tebogo took a slow breath, her hands resting lightly in her lap, steady, grounded, not because she was unafraid, but because she had already stepped too far forward to turn back now. Then we make sure it's undeniable, she said. The room stilled slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. Because that answer, it mattered. Sheikh Karim nodded once. Exactly. The next hours moved quickly, pieces coming together, documents aligning, inconsistencies forming a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And as Tebogo watched it unfold, she realized that this was what it meant to step into a different world. Not just opportunity, not just advancement, but responsibility. The kind that demanded more than skill, more than intelligence, but integrity. The willingness to stand in something that would not always be easy to carry. By the time the room cleared, the path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was defined. There would be confrontation, there would be resistance, and there would be a moment where everything that had been uncovered would have to be brought into the light. Tebogo stood near the window once more, looking out at the city that had not changed, even as her place within it had. And for a brief moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of it fully, not as something to escape, but as something she had chosen. You did more than translate today, Sheikh Karim said, stepping beside her. She didn't look at him. I know. A pause. Then you revealed something that was meant to stay hidden. She exhaled slowly. And now we deal with it. Yes. Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt different, not uncertain, not heavy but focused, as though both of them understood that the next step would not be about proving skill, but about standing firm in something that would not be easily accepted. Tebogo looked out at the city one last time, then turned back, ready. Not because she felt prepared, but because she knew she would not step away, and that was enough. The confrontation did not happen in anger. It did not arrive with raised voices or sudden accusations or the kind of dramatic explosion Tebogo might have once imagined when truth finally surfaced, because in the world she had stepped into power did not reveal itself through noise. It revealed itself through control, through precision, through the quiet certainty of evidence that could not be denied. 3 days later, the same people who had sat confidently around that polished conference table were gathered again. But this time the room felt different, not because the setting had changed, but because the balance within it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And as Tebogo took her place, not at the edge, not as someone waiting to serve, but as someone present, she could feel the weight of that difference settle into her posture, into her breath, into the steady calm she carried beneath the surface. Documents were placed on the table, not one, not two, but many. Each one marked, highlighted, connected, forming a pattern that no longer relied on interpretation or trust, because it had moved beyond language into something far more difficult to escape proof. No one spoke immediately, because everyone understood what was being presented and what it meant. Sheikh Karim did not raise his voice when he began. He did not accuse, he did not dramatize. He simply laid out the facts, one by one, each supported, each precise, each impossible to dismiss, without confronting the full structure behind it. And as he spoke, Tebogo listened, not just to the words, but to the reactions around the table, to the subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of expressions, the quiet calculations happening behind controlled faces. This pattern, he said calmly, appears in multiple agreements across different regions over an extended period of time. Silence, measured, careful. And in each case, he continued, the terms are presented as balanced, while the actual liability is transferred in a way that is not clearly communicated. One of the executives leaned forward slightly, his expression composed, but his tone sharper than before. "You are suggesting misconduct. I am presenting evidence," Sheikh Karim replied. The distinction was deliberate. Because accusation could be challenged, evidence could not. Tebogo felt the shift immediately. The room was no longer testing her. It was responding to something much larger, something that had already begun to reshape the ground beneath it. Another executive spoke this time more cautiously. "There may be differences in interpretation." Tebogo's eyes moved slightly, not toward him but toward the space between his words, because she understood now that language was often used as a shield, as a way to soften what could not be defended directly. "There are no differences in meaning," Sheikh Karim said, his voice still calm but firmer now only in how that meaning was presented. The weight of that statement settled fully, because it cut through the argument before it could fully form. And then, for the first time, someone looked directly at Tebogo. Not with dismissal, not with curiosity, but with something sharper, recognition. "You were the one who raised this," the man said. It was not a question. Tebogo met his gaze, her posture steady, her expression calm. Not defensive, not confrontational, but grounded in something she no longer needed to prove. Yes, a pause followed, because that single word carried more than agreement. It carried presence. It carried accountability. It carried the quiet reality that she had not only seen something others had missed, but had chosen not to ignore it. The man studied her for a moment longer, as though trying to reconcile the image he had formed before with the reality now in front of him. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed, not softened but adjusted. "You understand the implications of this?" Tebogo did not look away. "Yes." Another silence, but this one felt different, because now the question was no longer whether she belonged in that room. It was what she would do in it. The discussion continued, more controlled now, more careful, because every word mattered, every statement carried consequence, and as the details were examined, clarified, and aligned, the structure that had once hidden behind complexity became visible in a way that could not be undone. There were no dramatic admissions, no sudden confessions, but there was something else. Agreement, not spoken loudly, not declared openly, but present in the way resistance began to soften, in the way positions shifted, in the way the room moved from denial to recalibration. Because in the end, truth did not need permission. It only needed to be undeniable. By the time the meeting ended, the outcome was clear. The contracts would be revised, the structure would be corrected, and the pattern that had operated quietly for so long would no longer continue unnoticed. People stood, papers were gathered, voices lowered, and as Tebogo remained where she was for a moment longer, she realized that this quiet resolution, this controlled shift was what real change looked like in this world. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise, deliberate and lasting. She stepped out of the room, slowly, the weight of everything settling into her in a way that felt both heavy and steady, because she understood now that what she had done had not just changed a single deal, but had disrupted something larger, something that would take time to fully unravel but would not return to what it had been. In the corridor, Sheikh Karim joined her once more. "You handled that well," he said. It was the closest thing to praise she had received from him. Tebogo nodded slightly. I did what was necessary. He studied her for a moment. Yes, he said. You did. A pause followed. Then do you regret it? The question echoed something familiar. Tebogo thought of Mrs. Kumalo, of her answer, of the weight behind it. She looked ahead, her voice quiet but certain. No. And for the first time it was true without hesitation. Sheikh Karim gave a small nod. Good. There was that word again, but now it no longer felt like something given. It felt like something earned. Days passed, then weeks. And slowly, Tebogo's life reshaped itself around the decision she had made. Not in a sudden transformation, not in a way that erased where she had come from, but in a steady, deliberate progression that reflected something deeper than opportunity. It reflected growth. She worked, she learned, she was tested again and again, in rooms that questioned her, in conversations that challenged her, in moments where she was expected to fail. And each time she didn't. Not perfectly, not easily, but consistently, and over time, something changed. Not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself, because she no longer measured her worth by where she started, or by how others had once defined her, but by the choices she made, by the truth she carried, by the willingness to stand where she was needed, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, as she stood once again by a window overlooking the city, she caught her reflection in the glass, and this time she recognized it fully. Not as the girl who had learned to disappear, but as someone who had learned to remain, to speak, to choose. Invisible. That had once been her safety. But now it was something she had outgrown. Her phone buzzed softly. A message. Naledi. I saw you on TV today. You look different. Tebogo read it twice, then smiled slightly. Not because she had changed, but because she had finally allowed herself to become who she had always been capable of being. She typed back slowly, I am. And as she stood there looking out at the same city that had once felt like something she had to survive, Tebogo understood something with quiet clarity. Her life had not been given to her. It had been chosen, one decision at a time, one truth at a time. One moment where she refused to stay silent when it mattered most. And that, more than anything, was what had changed everything. Sometimes the biggest turning point in life does not come with applause or certainty, but with a quiet moment where you are forced to choose between safety and truth, between staying where you are accepted and stepping into a place where you must prove yourself. And while the world often teaches us to remain silent, to stay small, to wait for permission, stories like Tebogo's remind us that real change begins the moment we decide to speak, even when our voice trembles. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to move forward despite it. If this story touched you, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Right now, your voice matters here too. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because you never know which story might remind someone of their own strength.